And I'm really curious to hear about how you, with an art history background, came to the sciences yourself.
Yeah, so I actually love telling this story because I've always been interested in interdisciplinarity. I did a liberal arts degree before I went into art history, and while I was studying art history, I did do a minor in psychology, and I tended my interest focused towards neuropsychology of vision. Was a huge focus of mine, and for a time I was interested in arts therapy, which is usually what people think of when they hear, oh, you're doing psychology and art, so you must be going to be like an art therapist. And I considered it. I worked as an assistant dance therapist for a bit, but I came across at one of the Concordia used book sales David Edwards' book, Creativity in the Post-Google Generation, the book on art science. And reading it, I was fascinated because something had just clicked. It was like, I had always thought that psychology, specifically at that time I was looking at psychology and the arts, had this connection, but I didn't want to be an art therapist and I didn't know how else I could engage with it. And that book was my first opening into it. And, later that year, so I started my undergraduate in 2015. By 2016, by chance, Christian had put out the class, Convergence Initiative, Perceptions of Neuroscience. And it was actually directed towards artists. They wanted the art students to come and say, oh, I would love to join. And I was in art history, not in the visual arts. But I showed up and I said, you're going to need someone to coordinate between these artists and scientists. You're going to need someone to write about their works and to interview them. And I want to be that person right in the middle, bridging that gap, talking about it, and we've remained close friends and good colleagues ever since. So I think that was definitely what started me on that route. And another key moment, I feel like I'm babbling, but another key moment that still sticks with me to this day is my first lecture I had on the psychology of perception. My professor gave us this textbook that he would use in all his slides called Sensation and Perception. And at the introduction for each section was an artwork, which I found very interesting. And by the time we got to the lecture on visual perception, the front cover was a pointillist work by Camille Pissarro. And it was explaining optical mixture theory. So how we see two separate colors very close together. And when we see it from afar, our eyes, our visual perception, blends it. So you see blue next to yellow, and they're separate, but we still see green, even without it being mixed with paint. And this was used as a tool. The art was used as a tool to explain the science. This led me in my master's, which I finished just a couple years ago. It led me to look at Pissarro's work as a type of scientific medium of how you can access the science in the artwork. I was completely enamored with it. And the more I dug, the more I found. I worked with the Pissarro Family Archives in the Ashmolean Museum and found Pissarro's writings where he said the other pointillist artists like Seurat, they're not scientific enough. I want to do something that is methodological. I want to take these colors and there's method to it. And it was fascinating because it was something as simple as a visual aid that began it. A visual aid in a psychology class, which everyone can do. And it's when you think about it hard, and I think about the theory of it, of theoretically speaking, how do we access science and art and the paintings and what can they offer us and the viewer relation to, a piece of work, which can get very theory heavy, especially studying at Oxford. Coming out of that after and thinking about what I was looking at, I always came back to it's like a means of communicating both the art and science in a very simple way when we don't overthink it. You can look at Pissarro's work and look at the Pointillism, which is just painting that's made of small dots, and use it to explain optical mixture theory, which the artist was aware of because he was using texts written by Eugène Chevreulian, which is the Chevreulian color theory, which explains simultaneous color contrast. It explains how we do blend those and how the difference by putting one color next to the other can make one appear brighter or one appear darker. So it just gets fascinating the more you look at it and unravel it, and it's never black and white, I think. But that's the rabbit hole I went down, and I'm still going. So that's how I got into it.
I understand that you're starting a PhD on color theory at the Queen's Mary University, London. And I'm also curious when you mentioned your initial interest in art therapy. So has that interest kind of reappeared in your research on color theories, for instance? Because I was just I see a lot of studies that in why there's art shown in hospitals and how there's proof that that uplifts the mood and the health and the overall state of patients there because they're exposed and see the art every day. And there's certain categories of art that's displayed there. So I wonder if there's your initial interest that reappears in your research now.
Yeah, it definitely does. And art therapy is still interesting to me. It interests me as a discipline. I just don't think I'd be trained as an art therapist. But, when I was entertaining the idea in my undergrad, I did do some research on color theory used with Alzheimer's patients in painting the rooms. And there was just this consensus of certain colors, I think it was yellows and blues, that were just more appealing overall to patients who perhaps couldn't express themselves and what their preferences were. And it was just like a general look at how to keep people calm. And so studies like that, still come across during my research, and I enjoy them thoroughly. But more poignantly to my research, when I was looking at Pissarro's work, I was comparing it to a contemporary artist named Robert Pepperell, who I had the pleasure of interviewing for the Renaissance Lab project with Convergence, which I think will be published later this month. But he had a question that art therapists do need to engage with, and that's with certain psychological issues in the brain when there's something has a damage. So, for example, someone who has damage to their FFA, the fusiform face area, that is the part of our visual cortex that that allows us to recognize faces. And more broadly, if we can't recognize faces and maybe other objects, it's called visual agnosia. And Robert Pepperell questioned this haze, this fuzz that people with visual agnosia see, and he said, can I induce that through painting? Can I have other people experience it who don't have that damage to their brain? And the inquiry of how we perceive the world, how our brain understands it, and the tricks you can play on your brain was fascinating. He ended up working with Alumi Ishai and her neuroscience lab in Zurich to do studies where he would make what he would call these indeterminate paintings. So these paintings vaguely resembled 16th, 17th century masterpieces, as in he would copy the color scheme and the general movements, but you couldn't identify any one point. There'd be, for instance, swirls of what looked like flesh, and the more you look, you're trying to identify anything. And unlike an abstract work, your brain falls short. So usually when you're trying to identify objects, this is a very simplified version, but your brain will group all of the lines together, will look for motion, and with those collected objects, it will try and connect something to, sorry, I'm just checking that. Yeah, that will try and connect it to a referent. So, you look at a table, you realize it's a table, or even identifying an object and saying, I don't know what that is. Once you get there, if you don't know what it is, you can interpret it, and it goes kind of more to an imaginative state. But Pepperell was trying to hold you there, in the middle. Can't decide if you know it, can't decide if you don't. And that is predominantly the feeling that people get with visual agnosia. If you are looking for a good book about what that is like, there's, I forget who it's by, but the man who mistook the man who mistook his wife's head for a hat, which is a very fascinating book that explains that, and one that I believe Pepperell knew about. But that also makes, I'm realizing now talking to you that this particular visual agnosia and prosopagnosia, which is the one of not being able to see faces, was particularly interesting to me because I also did a project looking at Chuck Close. And Chuck Close is a brilliant artist who, because he can't identify faces, he breaks down photographs of people into almost like pixelated boxes. And he paints them all individually. And from afar, kind of like in the Pointillism works, it all comes together and your brain makes sense of what you're looking at. But being up close and trying to make sense is kind of how he sees people's faces. They don't really correlate to the people he knows. He recognizes them by voice. So in those ways, there are places in arts therapy that have brilliantly been explored by artists, and I think that is a super interesting area. Not just how the arts from a psychological point of view are being used to help people, but how the artists themselves, sometimes who suffer from different either developmental disabilities or who have some brain damage in some way, use the arts as a vehicle to explore, confront, and express what's going on. And though Robert Pepperell doesn't personally have any of these, again, he is drawing from some of that research from his neuroscience colleagues as well.
That's it for this episode of Beyond Codes and Aesthetics. If you like what you heard, you can subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever else you listen to your podcasts. Also, please take a moment to rate and review this podcast. It will help other listeners discover what we're doing. Beyond Codes and Aesthetics is produced by Kohei and translations on Himalaya Podcasts by Will Jung. Take care and see you next time.